Welcome back, everyone. This is Mr. Darkvale. Today we're covering 8 of the most disturbing true trucking stories ever sent in to this channel. Please subscribe, turn the bell on, because this channel is about real, patient horror instead of cheap scares. Share your own story in the comments. Your experience could be the next one we bring to light. And let's begin. 22 years I've been driving freight, and in that time you learn the difference between being tired and being wrong. Tired feels like sand behind your eyes and a stretch in your neck. Wrong feels like something you can't quite name yet, sitting low in your gut, waiting for you to catch up to it. That night on the interstate, I was tired first. Then I was wrong. I'd left the distribution yard a little after 9 with a load of restaurant equipment bound for a warehouse 11 hours out. The kind of run I could do with my eyes half shut, because I'd done it so many times before. By midnight, the world had thinned out to just me, the hum of the tires on grooved concrete, and the cone of my headlights swallowing white lines one after another. No taillights ahead, no headlights coming the other way through the median. Everybody with any sense was already home, and I remember thinking that, feeling almost smug about it, like I'd earned some private ownership of the road. Somewhere past a long, flat stretch with nothing on either side but dark fields, I passed a mile marker, 148, green sign, reflective white numbers, a little pitted from years of gravel kicked up by trucks like mine. Ordinary. I didn't think about it again until, by my reckoning, close to 20 minutes later, I passed another sign, 148. I laughed it off, told myself I'd misread it the first time, or the state had some marker foul up, a sign crew that missed a swap during a construction shuffle. It happens. Highway departments make mistakes same as anybody. I turned up the radio, some AM station fading in and out of static, and kept my foot steady at 68. Another 20 minutes. 148 again. That's when the tired feeling started sliding into the other thing. Because 68 miles an hour for 20 minutes is right around 22, 23 miles of pavement. There is no version of a paperwork error that puts the same sign in front of you 3 times in a row, evenly spaced, on a straight road with no exits, no turnarounds, nothing to double back on. I checked my odometer against the trip log I keep clipped to the visor, out of habit more than anything, and the numbers were climbing the way they should. The truck was moving. The world outside the windshield was not agreeing with it. I did what any driver does when something feels off at 1 in the morning. I called my wife. Not because there was anything she could do from our kitchen table 400 miles away, but because hearing a voice that knows you helps you find the edges of yourself again. I told her about the sign, tried to make it sound like a funny thing, a story for the dinner table. She got quiet in a way I didn't like, and I heard her keyboard clicking in the background. She said, "Hang on," and then she said something that took the funny right out of it. She said the State Department of Transportation's site showed that stretch had been renumbered 8 years back after a realignment project, and mile marker 148 didn't exist anymore. Hadn't existed, officially, since before our youngest was born. What I should have been passing, if the new numbering was right, was somewhere in the low 190s. I sat with that for a second, the phone warm against my ear, her breathing on the other end, and I told her I was probably just misreading the sign in the dark. The reflectors are old, maybe it says something else, and my eyes are tired. She didn't push it. Neither of us wanted to say out loud what we were both starting to think, which is that there wasn't a good explanation left that didn't involve something being wrong, that had nothing to do with my eyes. I told her I was going to stop and look at the thing properly. She didn't like that. I didn't love it either, but sitting there guessing felt worse than knowing. And 22 years on the road teaches you that the not knowing is what eats a man alive on a long haul. So I eased off, found a stretch of shoulder wide enough, and put the flashers on. The night was colder than the cab had let on, that damp kind of cold that comes up out of the ground more than out of the air. My flashlight beam found the sign standing there, just like always, bolted to its post, and up close, it looked like every other mile marker I'd passed 1,000 times in my life. Except the bolts were shiny, not rusted, not weathered, shiny. the way hardware looks when it's been touched recently. I ran my hand along the post, and it was solid, cold metal. Nothing strange about it to the touch, which somehow made it worse, because I wanted it to feel wrong, and it didn't. That's when I saw the ditch. There's a drainage culvert that runs along a lot of interstate shoulders, a dip before the fence line, usually full of gravel and weeds and the occasional blown tire tread. My light caught a shape down in it that didn't belong, and when I climbed down, I found a stack of signs. Not one, not two. A pile of them, maybe a dozen. All the same green, all the same white numbers. 148, 148, 148. Some of them bright and new, like the one bolted up top. Others faded and pocked with rust, so deep the numbers had nearly given out, like they'd been lying there for years, decades even, weather working on them, long after whatever put them there stopped caring. I crouched down next to the oldest one, the metal biting cold through my glove, and along the bottom edge, scratched into the paint with something sharp, was writing. Not vandalism, not the usual highway graffiti. Names, dates, short lines, like men had knelt right where I was kneeling and needed to leave something behind before they got back in their trucks. I recognized the habit because it's mine too, the same habit of a driver alone with too many hours and a knife on his belt, scratching something into a rest stop table so some part of him stays put while the rest of him keeps moving. One line near the bottom, newer than the others but not new, the scratch marks not yet fully rusted over, read like a man talking to himself, the way I'd been talking to myself for the last hour. It just said, still going. I didn't sleep that night, obviously, and I didn't call my wife back right then either, because I didn't have words yet for what I'd have told her. I climbed back into the cab, sat there with the engine running and my hands on the wheel without moving, and I made myself do the only thing that felt like it belonged to me anymore, which was drive. Because stopping hadn't fixed anything, and going back the way I came didn't feel like a real option, not with that ditch full of signs behind me, and no guarantee the road behind was any more honest than the road ahead. So I drove, and for the first time in hours, way off down the straightaway, I saw a set of taillights. Two small red points, steady, keeping their distance, no matter what I did with the accelerator. I sped up. They held their gap. I let off. They held it still, like we were roped together at some fixed length neither one of us had agreed to. I told myself it was just another truck, somebody running the same lonely stretch, and there was almost relief in that thought. The idea that I wasn't the only living thing left out here. I flashed my brights a couple times, the way you do to say I see you, friend, and the taillights flashed back. Exactly once. Exactly when mine had. I didn't test that a second time. I watched the mile markers after that, the way you watch a wound to see if it's getting worse. 148 passed again, and again, evenly spaced, patient as a clock, and somewhere in there, I stopped being frightened in the sharp way, and started being frightened in the tired way, the way you get scared of a thing for so long that it just becomes the shape of the night around you. The radio had gone to nothing but static a while back, and I hadn't noticed when. My coffee had gone cold in the cup holder, and I didn't remember not drinking it. The last one I passed, and I know it was the last one, because after it, I stopped talking about any of this, even to myself, even in my own head, was not like the others. The post was the same, the bolts were the same, but the sign itself looked old, in a way none of the others in that ditch had looked old, not rusted through, but faded soft, the green gone pale and grayish, like something left out in the sun for 40 years. The white numbers worn down at the edges into a shape that was almost, but not quite, 148, like the metal itself had gotten tired of being what it was supposed to say. The lot lights at the sundown travel plaza were half dead when I pulled in, 3 of them buzzing that sick orange color, and the rest just gone black. And I remember thinking that was strange for a place that called itself a 24-hour stop. It was Christmas Eve, almost 10 at night, and I had maybe 40 minutes left on my clock before the app locked me out and forced my break, whether I liked it or not. First solo run. 6 days out, 5 behind me, 1 to go. And I'd been telling myself the whole trip that the hard part was the driving, not this. Not sitting still in the dark by myself. I swung the trailer wide and backed into a spot near the fuel island because it still had light on it. And when I climbed down to walk my tires, I looked across the lot and it was empty. Completely empty. No cabs idling, no reefer units humming, nothing but cracked asphalt, and a diner with a wreath taped crooked to the door, and a paper sign that said closed for the holiday. I remember being almost glad about that, because an empty lot meant nobody bothering me while I ate my sandwich and tried to sleep sitting up like my trainer taught me. I climbed back in, locked the doors, and when I looked up from my phone maybe 90 seconds later, there was a truck at the far end of the lot that hadn't been there before. I don't mean I hadn't noticed it. I mean I had just looked at that exact spot, and there was nothing, and now there was a full rig sitting there. No headlights on, no sound of it pulling in, like it had just settled into place while I wasn't watching. I told myself I was tired. 14 hours of driving does things to your eyes. Your trainer had said that too. Said you start seeing shapes on the shoulder that aren't there. So I let it go for a minute. Ate my sandwich. Kept glancing up. The cab light in that other truck flicked on around 11. I could see it clear across the lot, a little yellow square glowing in the dark, and I watched it for a driver climbing down to stretch his legs or check his straps, the way you do. Nobody came out. The light just sat there burning, and after a while it clicked off again, and that bothered me more than I wanted to admit. So I grabbed the little pair of binoculars my dad had thrown in my bag as a joke gift, and I looked at the door of that cab, at the company decal on it, because reading logos calms me down. It's a habit, gives my brain something normal to chew on. It said Whitlock Freight Lines, same as a carrier I'd actually hauled for out of Amarillo 2 years back before I got my own authority sorted. And for half a second that felt like a relief. Like, oh, that's just another company truck. Nothing strange about that. Then I noticed the DOT number stenciled under it was 7 digits instead of 6, and the paint wasn't paint at all. It was a wrap, cheap vinyl, with the edges lifting at the corner near the wheel well, the way a decal does when it's been slapped on fast and not baked in right. My trainer had drilled this into me during orientation. Some crews clone a legit carrier's name and numbers onto a truck, so they can sit at a lot looking like they belong, so nobody questions them when they're circling for an unlocked trailer or an easy target. He'd called it gate cloning, said it happens more at holiday stops because the lots run empty, and there's nobody around to notice a truck that doesn't add up. I sat there with those binoculars shaking a little in my hands, because I wasn't looking at something spooky anymore. I was looking at something built on purpose, to fool exactly a person like me. I decided I was done sitting still. I started my truck to roll it over to a spot under the working lights near the store, figuring visibility was worth more than a good parking angle, and that's when my phone rang, a number with no name and no area code I recognized. I almost didn't answer it. I did anyway, because some dumb, hopeful part of me thought it might be dispatch checking in on a holiday run. A man's voice, calm, almost friendly, said he was calling to confirm my location for load verification, said my name, said the trailer number stenciled on my unit, said I looked like I'd found a quiet spot to park for the night. I hadn't given anybody my trailer number tonight. I hadn't told a soul where I'd stopped, not even my own dispatcher, because I hadn't checked in yet. My check-in wasn't due for another 20 minutes. I hung up and called my actual dispatcher direct, not through the company line, her personal cell, because we'd swapped numbers before I left in case of emergencies. And she picked up groggy and confused, said nobody from the office had called me, said the office was closed for the holiday and had been since 4 that afternoon. Then she went quiet for a second and told me something that made my stomach drop lower than the cold outside. The load board system our broker used had gotten hit a few weeks back. Driver names, phone numbers, routes, all of it sitting exposed for a while before anyone caught it and locked it down. She said it like she was trying to be reassuring, said the company had sent out a notice, said it was probably nothing. I wasn't thinking about probably. I was thinking about the fact that somebody hadn't picked this lot at random and hadn't picked me at random either. Somebody had my name off a list before I ever pulled in here. I told her I was leaving, that I'd find another spot even if it burned my hours, and she said do it. Stay on the phone with me while you drive if you need to. I set my phone in the cup holder and reached back to grab my jacket off the sleeper bunk before I pulled out, and that's when my hand caught on something that wasn't mine. A strap, canvas, cold, wedged down between the mattress and the wall where I always kept my duffel and nothing else. I froze with my hand still on it. My curtain, the one that separates the cab from the bunk, was pushed back, further than I ever leave it, bunched against the wall instead of hanging straight, the way it does every single night I've slept back there since I started this job. And the bunk itself, when I finally made myself look at it straight on, still had a shape pressed into the blanket, a warmth I could feel with the back of my hand, that no empty mattress holds onto on its own in December cold. I don't remember deciding to look up. I just did, some reflex older than thinking, and in the black glass of my driver's side window, in that thin reflection where the dash lights catch just enough to show you something, there was a face behind my shoulder, closer than the length of the bunk should have allowed, and I spun around so fast my seatbelt caught and yanked me back down, and the sleeper was empty. Curtain swaying like something had just let go of it. Nothing there. Nothing but my own breath, fogging up in the cold, and my dispatcher's tinny voice coming out of the cup holder, asking if I was still there, if I was okay. Why wasn't I answering her? I've been driving Route 9 for going on 31 years now, hauling parts for the same auto supply outfit since I was 26 years old. And in all that time, I've picked up my share of people standing on the shoulder with nowhere else to go. Flat tires, dead batteries, boyfriends who got dropped off out of spite 20 miles from anywhere. My father used to say, you don't leave a person out on a dark road. Not in this county. Not with nothing around for 15 miles but corn stubble and a couple of turkey farms. So when I came around the bend past the Route 9 bridge that night, a little after 11, and saw a woman standing on the gravel with no car behind her and no flashlight in her hand, I did what I've always done. I slowed down and I stopped. She wasn't dressed for it. Middle of November, the kind of cold that gets into your back teeth, and she had on a thin gray cardigan over a housedress. No coat, no bag, feet in socks that had gone dark and wet at the heel, like she'd been walking on the shoulder a while. I rolled the window down and asked if her car had broken down somewhere. She said no, she didn't have a car, just needed a ride. I told her to get in before she froze, and she did, quiet as anything, folding her hands in her lap like she was sitting in a waiting room. I asked where she needed to go, and she gave me an address on Cutter Hollow Road. The second she said it, something in my gut went tight, because I knew that address. Everybody who's driven this county long enough knows that address. That's the old Kessler place, or it was, burned halfway to the ground 12, 13 years back. Chimney still standing out there like a tombstone last I saw it. Nobody's lived on that lot since. I used to haul brake pads and filters out that way when Ed Kessler still had his garage, knew the family a little, knew what happened to them. I didn't say any of that to her. I just told her that was a long way out, near an hour with the roads the way they are, and she said that was fine. She just needed to be there before midnight. That's the part that stuck with me. Not begging me to hurry, not checking a phone, since she didn't have one that I could see. Just that flat, steady voice. Before midnight. Like she'd already done the math 100 times in her head. We drove a while without talking. The heater in my trucks never worked right. Blows warm on your ankles and nowhere else. And I noticed she wasn't shivering the way a person ought to be after standing out in that cold in socks. She just sat there watching the dark go by, calm as still water, and I remember thinking that was the part that didn't sit right with me. More than the address, more than anything. People who are cold act cold. She wasn't acting like anything at all. Somewhere past the county line, I tried to make conversation, the way you do. Asked if she'd grown up around here. She said she had, a long time ago, and asked if Ruthie's Diner was still open, the one out past the feed store. Said she used to get the Friday fish fry there as a kid. I told her Ruthie's had been closed going on 6 years now, boarded up after the owner passed. She just nodded, slow, like she already half knew that, and was checking it against something. I looked over at her a couple times after that and caught her watching the dashboard clock instead of the road, the little glowing 11:34, 11:41, like she was counting something down that only she could see the end of. I've driven drunk men, grieving men running from the law probably, and none of them ever put a stillness in the cab like that woman did. I'm not ashamed to say, by the time we hit the crossroads by the quick stop, my hands weren't quite steady on the wheel anymore. I told her I needed to gas up, which was true enough. Tank was getting low, but if I'm honest, I also wanted 5 minutes outside that cab to get my head straight. She said she'd wait in the truck. I went in to pay Denny, who's run that register some 20 years, and while he was ringing me up, I found myself looking at the corkboard by the door, the one that's always got yard sale flyers and a lost beagle notice curling up at the corners. And there, pinned up near the bottom, gone yellow at the edges, like it had been there a good while, was a missing person flyer with a photograph on it. A woman, mid-30s, dark hair, same face, same eyes, staring right out of that piece of paper at me. Dana Merrick, missing 2 years that October. Last seen in the county. Contact the sheriff's office with any information. I stood there long enough that Denny asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, paid for my gas, and walked back out to that truck with my heart going harder than it had any right to at my age. Whatever I'd let get into that cab with me, ghost or something worse, I was about to find out. I didn't say anything right off. Pulled back onto Route 9, got us moving again, and let about a mile go by while I figured out how to ask a question like that. Finally, I just came out with it. I told her there was a flyer back at that gas station, a missing persons flyer, and it had her face on it. I watched her out of the corner of my eye the whole time I said it, half expecting her to go thin as smoke, right there in my passenger seat. She didn't disappear. She went quiet for a long moment, and then she let out a breath like she'd been holding it 2 years, and she started talking. She said her name was Dana, and yes, that was her on the flyer. And no, nobody had taken her anywhere against her will. She'd left on her own the night after her 32nd birthday, walked out of her father's house with nothing but the clothes on her back, because she couldn't do one more night of him drunk and screaming about who she'd become, who she'd chosen to love, what she'd embarrassed him into being in a town where everybody knew his name. She said she'd hitchhiked to the bus station, same as tonight, gotten to the city, changed her name to her middle name for work, gotten sober on her own terms, built a small, quiet life nobody from home could find their way into. She never called to say she was alive because she wasn't ready for what calling would mean, and her mother, not knowing any of that, had filed a report with the sheriff 2 years back and never taken it off the books, kept those flyers up out of some stubborn hope. Dana said she didn't even know they were still out there until tonight. Tonight, she said, her sister had tracked her down through a mutual friend on Facebook and called the diner where she waits tables, breathless, saying their father had taken a bad turn, stage 4, hospice care set up in the front room of the house, and the nurse had told the family it likely wouldn't be much longer, maybe hours, maybe less. Her sister said if she wanted any kind of goodbye, any chance to say what needed saying, she had to come now, tonight, before it was too late to matter. Dana had left work in her apron, no purse, phone dying in her pocket before she even made the first bus, walked 2 miles when the bus let her off short of the transfer station because the connecting route had stopped running for the night, and started sticking her thumb out on Route 9 somewhere around 10. She said she'd have walked the whole way barefoot if she had to. Midnight wasn't a superstition to her. It was just the number the hospice nurse had given her sister as a guess, and she'd been chasing that guess for 6 hours straight. I sat with that a minute, both hands on the wheel, feeling about 2 inches tall for where my mind had gone back at that gas station. Then I told her the other thing, the thing that had been sitting sour in my stomach since she first gave me that address. I told her the house she was headed to, out on Cutter Hollow. That was the old Kessler place. Burned bad, more than a decade back. Nobody had lived there since, not as far as I knew. She looked at me like I'd said something in another language. She told me her family's last name wasn't Kessler. It was Merrick. And yes, there'd been a fire on that lot once, long before her family ever bought it. Her father had gotten the land cheap 4 years back, precisely because nobody local wanted a property with that kind of history attached to it. And he'd built new on the old foundation, kept the chimney standing, because her mother liked the way it looked against the tree line. I hadn't driven out that fork of Cutter Hollow myself in probably 5 years, not since the county rerouted deliveries around the bridge repair, and it hit me then that I'd been carrying around a dead man's address in my head and calling it the present. There was no ghost on that road tonight. There was just an old man's memory that hadn't caught up to how much time had gone by, sitting behind the wheel, scaring himself over a house that wasn't even the same house anymore. I didn't say much after that. Just drove faster than I probably should have on those curves, and she let me, hands pressed flat against her knees, watching the clock tick past 11:50, like it owed her something. We came up on the place at 11:56. Porch light on, 2 cars in the gravel drive, a shape of a woman standing in the open front door, with the light behind her, arms already lifting, before Dana even got the truck door open. I watched her run up that yard in her wet socks, watched the woman in the doorway come down the steps to meet her halfway, both of them holding on to each other, like the ground might give out. I sat there in the truck with the engine running, not sure if I should leave or wait, feeling like I'd wandered into somebody's whole life without an invitation. A younger woman came out a few minutes later, must have been the sister, and walked over to my window to thank me, tears still wet on her face. She told me their father was still with them, still breathing, and that when the nurse heard a car pull up, she'd leaned down close to him and told him Dana was here, and his eyes had come open for the first time in almost a day. She said he'd said her name, just the once, clear as anything. I told her I was glad I'd been on that road, and I meant it more than I think she understood. I found out a few days later, through Denny at the gas station, the way news moves through a county like this, that Dana's father had passed, a little after 1 in the morning, with both his daughters in the room and his wife holding his hand. Held on past his own midnight, past what the nurse had guessed. I don't know what to call that, except a man waiting on something he needed to see before he could let go. I still drive Route 9 most nights, same as always. I don't scare easy, never have, but I'll tell you I take that fork past Cutter Hollow slower now than I used to, not because I think there's anything out there waiting on the shoulder, but because I know now how much can go unfinished between people who love each other, and how far somebody will walk in the cold and the dark just to get back to it in time. I called my own boy the week after all that happened. First time in going on 3 years. Didn't have a good reason to wait that long. Never do. The engine started coughing about 40 miles out from the state line, right around the point where the highway thins down to 2 lanes and the gas stations get further apart. I'd been driving since noon, headed home for Thanksgiving, and I remember thinking it sounded like a stutter, not a full failure, so I kept going another few miles, hoping it would work itself out. It didn't. By the time I saw the rest area sign, I was losing power on the inclines, and I coasted off the exit and rolled into the lot, on fumes of momentum, more than anything the engine was still providing. It died completely, just as I pulled into a spot near the far end, away from the 2 other cars parked closer to the building. I called it in right away. The woman on the line was polite but straightforward about it. Every truck in the region was backed up because of the holiday, people breaking down left and right trying to get to family. And she told me it could be 2 hours, maybe closer to 3. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there for a minute just letting that sink in. Outside it was already going dark, that early November dark that drops fast once the sun dips below the tree line, and the temperature was falling with it. The rest area itself was nothing special. A single building with vending machines and restrooms, a few picnic tables under a metal awning, sodium lights buzzing over the parking spots. Past the edge of the asphalt, maybe 40 yards out, the ground sloped down into a line of pine and scrub oak that ran the length of the property, and disappeared into real woods behind it. I'd passed 100 rest stops like it. I turned off my hazards to save what battery I had left and got out to stretch my legs, since I figured I'd be sitting for a while. That's when I saw something move along the tree line. Low to the ground at first, just a shift in the dark that could have been anything. And my first thought was deer, because I'd seen plenty of them grazing at the edges of lots like this, on drives through this stretch before. I didn't think much of it. I walked a slow line along the front of my truck, working feeling back into my legs, glancing over now and then, just to keep track of it out of habit more than concern. It took me a few minutes to notice the shape wasn't grazing. It was pacing. When I walked toward the building, it moved parallel to me, staying roughly the same distance back in the trees. When I stopped to check my phone, it stopped too. I told myself, deer do that. They track movement. They get spooked and reposition. And for a while, that explanation held up fine, because I wasn't really testing it, just observing it out of the corner of my eye while I did other things. Then I decided to test it on purpose. I walked 10 feet to my left, slow and deliberate, and watched the shape shift the same distance in the same direction, keeping pace like it was tethered to me. I stopped dead. It stopped dead. I stood there for a solid 30 seconds without moving a muscle, and neither did it. And somewhere in that stillness, the deer explanation stopped making sense to me, because deer don't hold a position like that. They flick their tails, they put their heads down, they shift their weight. This didn't move at all until I did. I went inside to use the restroom, partly because I actually needed to, and partly because I wanted a minute away from the window. On my way back out, I passed a corkboard by the vending machines, the kind with flyers for lost dogs and church bake sales, and pinned in the corner, sun-bleached almost to nothing, was a missing person flyer. A man, mid-30s, last seen at this rest area 2 years back, on a night drive similar to mine. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading the small print, the phone number for the tip line, the date. I told myself it didn't mean anything. People go missing everywhere. But I felt the ground shift a little under the whole situation, like the rest area had a history I hadn't known to be scared of 5 minutes earlier. When I walked back out, there was a second car in the lot that hadn't been there before, a dark sedan parked at an angle about 60 feet from mine. Its headlights were off, but the engine was still running. I could hear it idling low. I waited for someone to get out, stretch, head for the restrooms like a normal traveler would. Nobody did. The car just sat there, engine turning over, windows too dark under the lot lights for me to see if anyone was even in the driver's seat. I decided the smart move was to get back in my own truck and lock the doors, which I did, and I sat there watching both the sedan and the tree line at once, my pulse doing something I didn't love. After a few minutes, I got out again anyway, telling myself I needed the vending machine more than I needed to sit still, which wasn't really true. I think I just wanted to move. I bought a bag of pretzels I didn't want and walked back to my truck, and that's when I noticed my driver's side mirror was folded flat against the door. I'd left it extended. I remembered checking it before I got out the first time, an old habit from years of parking in tight spots. It was folded in now, tucked against the glass like someone had pushed it there on their way past. I called my sister because I needed to hear a voice that wasn't mine. I told her about the shape in the trees, the mirror, the sedan sitting there with nobody visible inside it. She was kind about it, but practical, said I'd been driving 8 hours straight, and my eyes were probably doing what eyes do when you're that tired and it's that dark, and she told me to just sit tight, with the doors locked until the tow showed up. While I was talking to her, I mentioned I'd stopped for gas about an hour back, and describing it out loud, I realized there'd been a car idling at the edge of that gas station lot too, headlights off, nobody visibly getting in or out. I hadn't thought about it at the time. Saying it to her now, it didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. It felt like a pattern I was only noticing after the fact. A few minutes after I hung up, the sedan's engine cut off entirely. No lights, nothing. I watched it for a long stretch of silence before it started back up and pulled out of the lot, rolling past close enough that I could have read a plate if the lighting had cooperated. It didn't, not fully, but in the wash of another car, passing on the highway, I caught a flash of the corner of the plate, a partial number and a state sticker in the same spot I remembered from the gas station. I couldn't have sworn to it in a courtroom. But I knew what I'd seen, and it didn't feel like guessing. With the sedan gone, and the shape in the trees still holding its position, I got out one more time and popped my hood, using my phone flashlight to look at the engine for myself, mostly because I needed something to do with my hands. I don't know engines well, but I know what a clean disconnect looks like versus something that shook loose from wear, and one of the wire clamps near the battery wasn't corroded or frayed. It was just off, sitting to the side, like it had been pulled by hand and set down rather than vibrated loose over miles of driving. I stood there looking at it for a long time, feeling something colder than the weather settle into my chest. I know it wasn't smart, but I walked toward the tree line with my flashlight up, telling myself I needed to see something concrete, one way or another. The grass gave way to soft mud near the edge, and in that mud I found footprints, human ones, boot tread, not hoof marks, not paw prints, nothing that belonged to a deer or a dog or anything with 4 legs. They ran in a tight back-and-forth line along the very edge of the tree cover, matching almost exactly the path I'd walked earlier when I was pacing near my truck, mirrored like a shadow cast onto the ground instead of the air. That's when I heard the breathing. Close, controlled, coming from somewhere off to my left near the picnic shelter, rather than from the trees at all. Low, and even like someone working hard to keep it quiet and not quite managing it. I didn't run, but I didn't waste time either, walking backward toward my truck, with my eyes on the dark the whole way, not willing to turn my back on it. Headlights swept into the lot a minute later, and my whole body loosened with relief, thinking it was finally the tow truck, but the vehicle only slowed as it passed the entrance, brake lights flaring red, and holding there for several long seconds, like whoever was driving was taking a good look at me standing alone in the lot, before it pulled back onto the highway and disappeared. Same shape, same dark color as the sedan from before. The actual tow truck showed up about 20 minutes after that, orange lights spinning across the asphalt, and in the moment those lights swept the tree line, the shape that had been holding its position for the better part of 2 hours was simply gone. Not moving away, not retreating through the brush that I could hear or see. Just gone, like it had been let go of. The driver was an older guy, unhurried, the kind of tired that comes from doing the same job on every holiday for 20 years. He hooked up my truck without much conversation, and somewhere in the middle of it, I told him what I'd seen, the pacing, the footprints, the sedan. He didn't laugh it off, and he didn't look surprised either, which somehow unsettled me more than if he had. He said this stretch of rest area got calls like that more than people would guess. Said there were guys who camped back in those woods on and off. Said the state had talked about closing the place down a few times over the years, but never did. He said it happens more than people think, and left it right there. No further explanation offered. Already moving on to the paperwork on his clipboard like the subject was closed. I climbed into the cab of the tow truck and watched the rest area shrink behind us as we pulled out. The lot lights, the vending machine glow, the dark line of trees behind it all. Nothing moved back there that I could see. As we merged onto the on-ramp, I caught the side mirror angle just right, and for 1 second, right where my truck had been parked, there was a shape standing in the exact spot, arms at its sides, facing the road, the way I'd been facing it earlier in the night. Then the mirror shifted with the turn, and it was gone, and I couldn't tell you if I'd really seen it or just wanted to, after a night like that, my eyes doing exactly what my sister said they'd do. I didn't mention it to the driver. I didn't call my sister back either. Not that night. I just watched the dark highway roll past the windshield the rest of the way home, and I never did get an answer for any of it. Not one that made sense. Not one I could hand to somebody else and have them nod along with. Some things just happen to you out there on the edge of the road, and then they're over, and you're left carrying them home with nowhere to put them down. I hadn't planned on driving that night. I'd planned on turkey, and my mother's dining room, and the particular silence that happens when everyone's chewing and nobody wants to bring up the empty chair. That was supposed to be the whole evening. Instead, I said something I shouldn't have said about how she'd rearranged the good plates like nothing had changed. And she said something back about how I always did this, always left when things got hard, and I grabbed my coat before I'd even decided to. By the time I hit the highway, it was full dark, and I was hungry in that low, mean way that makes you angry at red lights. Every place I passed was closed. Gas stations with their pumps taped off, a diner with chairs stacked on tables and a handwritten sign taped inside the glass, a fast food place with its drive-through cone blinking through an empty lot. The radio gave up somewhere around the county line, sliding into static no matter how I turned the dial, and my fuel light clicked on, right as the first spits of rain hit the windshield. I remember thinking, with the kind of flat resignation you get after an hour of driving nowhere, that I was going to end up sleeping in the car on a Thanksgiving night, because I couldn't stand to sit at my own mother's table. Then I came around a bend and saw it lit up on the right side of the road, the only building for what felt like miles that had its lights on. A low, long building with a buzzing sign that said, "Open" in orange script, windows glowing, that warm yellow that a kitchen gets when there's food behind it. I actually said something out loud in the car, some relieved little curse, like I'd been rescued. I pulled into the lot, and there wasn't another car in it. Not one. Just my headlights, sweeping across empty asphalt, and puddles catching the neon. I sat there a second with the engine ticking, telling myself that made sense. Everybody who'd want to be somewhere already was somewhere, and the only people working a diner on Thanksgiving were the people who had nowhere better to be, same as me. It made sense. I got out anyway. The door didn't make a sound when I opened it. I noticed that before I noticed anything else, the absence of the little bell you expect on a door like that, the kind that's supposed to jingle and doesn't. The place was warm and smelled like coffee and grease, and it looked, in every way that mattered, like a diner should look on a slow night. A row of booths along the window, a counter with round stools, a pass-through to the kitchen, where I could see a cook in a white apron. It was just quiet. Quiet in a way that didn't match how full and lived-in the room looked. A waitress came around the counter before I'd said a word, already reaching for a menu. "Table for one, hun?" she asked. And I said yeah, and didn't think much of it, because what else would I be, standing there alone in a wet coat at 10 at night? I sat in a booth by the window. Through the pass-through, I could see the cook standing at the flat top, spatula in hand, and there was something about him that took me a second to place. He wasn't doing anything. Not cooking, not scraping the grill, just standing there, the way a person stands in a photograph. Then, like someone had pressed play, he flipped something with a flat, clean motion, and the sizzle followed a half-second late, and I told myself the light in there was just bad, that I'd caught him between motions, nothing more. I ordered the meatloaf because it was the first thing on the menu and I was too hungry to think it over. She wrote nothing down. She just smiled and said, "That's what your father always got," and turned to walk the order back. I sat there a second, with my mouth slightly open. I hadn't told her anything about my father. I hadn't told her my name. I decided, the way you decide things when you want very badly for them to be nothing, that it was just a phrase, a waitress thing, something she probably said to every man who walked in alone. Guys like meatloaf. That's all it was. The food came fast. Too fast, if I'm honest. I hadn't even finished my coffee, hadn't heard a bell ding or a ticket get called, and there it was in front of me, steam still coming off the gravy like it had just left the grill, though I never once saw it leave the grill. I ate anyway. I was hungry enough not to interrogate a warm plate of food. Halfway through, the jukebox in the corner clicked and started playing on its own, no one having gone near it, and it took me a few bars to place the song, something my dad used to hum under his breath while he worked on the truck in the garage, a song I hadn't heard outside of my own memory in probably 15 years. I put my fork down for a second. I told myself it was a coincidence, an old song, the kind lots of dads probably hummed in lots of garages. When the waitress came back to refill my coffee, I asked her, just to have something to say, how long they stayed open, on a night like this. She tilted the pot and said, Long as anybody needs us to be. Which isn't really an answer. And I laughed a little, because I didn't know what else to do with it. And she smiled like she'd meant it as a joke, though I couldn't tell if it was one. I checked my phone out of habit. No bars. Not even the one flickering bar you get out in the middle of nowhere. Just a flat, empty signal icon, like the phone had given up trying. I looked up at the clock on the wall to check the time instead, and it read 9:15. My phone, dead battery-wise but still lit for one more second, said it was closer to 11. I figured the wall clock had stopped, the way clocks in places like this always seem to, and let it go. That's when I noticed the clipping, taped up by the register, yellowed at the edges, behind a thin film of tape that had gone amber with age, was a newspaper article. I couldn't read all of it from where I sat, but I could read the headline well enough, something about a fire, and under a smaller photo I could just make out the name of the diner, the same name that had been on the sign outside, the same script. I didn't get up to read the rest. I told myself, old buildings keep old newspapers, that it didn't mean what it looked like it meant. I looked at the waitress again, while she topped off a cup, 2 stools down, that nobody was sitting at. I watched her face for a while, not really meaning to, just letting my eyes rest there, while my mind chewed on the article, and it took me an embarrassingly long stretch of time to understand what was bothering me about her. She hadn't blinked, not once since she'd first walked up to my booth. I watched another 10, 15 seconds, waiting for it, and it didn't come, and I had to look down at my plate and take a breath and tell myself I was tired, that I'd been driving for hours, and my eyes were playing the kind of trick tired eyes play. When I was done, I asked for the check and reached for my card. The little machine she brought over just sat there, blinking a red light, no matter how many times she tried it. And finally, she shrugged and said, "Cash only, hun. Always has been." Like this was something I should have already known. I patted my jacket, not expecting much, and found a handful of bills and change in my pocket that I didn't remember having. Old bills, a couple of coins with dates on them older than I was. It came out to almost exactly what the check said I owed, which struck me as strange even as I was doing it, like the numbers had been waiting for those exact coins. I looked at the check before I left it on the table. Below the total was a date stamped in faded ink, and it wasn't today's date. It wasn't even close. It was a date I recognized instantly and didn't want to. A date that had nothing to do with Thanksgiving at all. The date, 9 years back, that we buried my father. I stood there, staring at that little slip of paper for longer than made sense, my thumb pressed against the edge of it, and then I folded it once and put it in my pocket, instead of leaving it on the table, because some part of me needed to still have it once I was outside, needed proof that I hadn't imagined the numbers. I said goodnight to no one in particular and walked out into the lot. My car was right where I'd left it, rain coming down steady now, and I turned back once before I got in, the way you do, just to look at a place one more time. And for just a second, less than a second really, barely long enough to call it seeing anything at all, the diner looked different. Older, the paint duller, the sign's orange glow thinner, like I was looking at a photograph of the building instead of the building itself. Then, a truck's high beams swept the lot behind me, and when I looked again, it was just a diner, lit up warm, open on a holiday night, same as it had looked when I pulled in. I got in my car and drove until I found a gas station open 2 exits down, and I sat in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights for a long time before I went in, not really thinking about anything, just sitting. I told my mother about it, eventually, weeks later, on a phone call, where we were both trying to be gentler with each other than we'd been at Thanksgiving. I mentioned the diner, almost as a joke, a strange little detour on a bad night, and she went quiet on the other end, in a way that made me sit up. She asked me what it was called. I told her. There was a long pause, and then she said that diner had burned down when she was a girl, that her own father, my grandfather, used to take her there on Sunday mornings before it happened, and that nobody had ever rebuilt on that stretch of road since. I didn't say anything back for a while. I still have the receipt in a drawer I don't open much. The date on it hasn't changed. I've driven that stretch of highway twice since, once in daylight and once at night, slow both times, watching the shoulder for a building that was never there either time, just an empty lot going to weeds, and a sign, if you look close enough through the grass, that still says something in faded orange paint, too worn now to read. We took the Thanksgiving run because the pay was double and the roads were empty, and when you've been team driving as long as me and Wyatt have, empty roads start to sound better than turkey and a table full of people asking when you're going to get a real job. Cross Anchor Freight had a reefer load of produce that had to be in Denver by Friday morning, and nobody else on the board wanted the miles, so we split the wheel every 4 hours the way we always do, ran our hours legal, drank gas station coffee, and listened to the same 3 stations that still play music after midnight on a holiday. Somewhere past 10, dispatch pinged the tablet with a weather advisory. Ice building on the grade west of a little scale house we both knew, a place called Calder Summit. At the bottom of a stretch, everybody on that route just calls Cutter's Pass because of how it switches back on itself twice before it lets you down the other side. Company policy said any truck running that corridor after an ice advisory had to check in at the scale house for a chain inspection before they'd let you take the grade, holiday or not. Wyatt groaned about it, said the whole point of driving on Thanksgiving was that nobody makes you stop for anything, and I laughed because he wasn't wrong. What we didn't expect was for the place to be lit up like a regular Tuesday. Calder Summit runs a skeleton crew on holidays. Sometimes nobody at all. Just an automated bypass light that flashes green if your transponder clears. But as we came down the approach, the whole lot was lit, floodlights on the scale, the little booth glowing yellow against the dark like somebody'd left every light in the building on and walked away. We pulled in anyway, because that's what you do, lit up or not, advisory or not. And the lot was empty. No other trucks, no cars, nothing but a state cruiser, sitting off to the side with its lights off, and nobody in it that we could see. Wyatt cut the engine, and we sat there, a second longer than we needed to, both of us doing that thing where you scan a place before you get out of the truck, not because you think something's wrong, just because it's a habit that keeps you alive out here. Inside, the booth was empty too. The counter light was on, a little space heater humming under the desk, a coffee mug sitting there still steaming a little at the rim, like somebody had just set it down. And right there on the counter, open to a page, pen resting across it at an angle, was the check-in ledger, the kind these older stations still keep alongside the digital system, especially for chain law stops, where they want a driver's signature on paper. Wyatt leaned over it to sign us in, the way we've done 100 times at 100 stations, and then he went quiet, in a way that made me look over his shoulder. Our names were already on the page, both of them. Dale Kessler and Wyatt Combs, Cross Anchor Freight, Unit 1147, checked in for a chain inspection, time listed as 3:47 a.m. It wasn't even midnight yet. Wyatt laughed first, said it had to be some kind of mix-up, another team running under a similar fleet number. Maybe somebody transposed a digit. I wanted to believe that too, so I pulled the ledger closer and read it again, and that's when the mix-up stopped making sense. Because the unit number wasn't similar, it was exact, down to the last digit, and next to it, somebody had noted a detail that isn't on any manifest or any transponder record, a detail only the two of us would know to write down. Cracked mirror bracket, driver's side. Wyatt had clipped a gas pump with that mirror back in July, and never got the bracket replaced, just zip-tied it and left it. Nobody logs that. Nobody even notices that, unless they've stood next to our truck and looked. We stood there a minute, not saying much, and I remember the space heater humming, and the coffee mug still steaming, and neither one of us wanting to say the obvious thing, which was that somebody had written this entry before we ever pulled in, and they'd known things about our truck that weren't on paper anywhere else. I got my phone out and called dispatch to sort it, figuring maybe somebody rerouted another team through here and made an entry mistake on our behalf. The woman who picked up sounded half asleep and told me straight out that we were the only truck Cross Anchor had moving anywhere near that corridor tonight. Everybody else got rerouted south hours ago, once the ice advisory came through. Then she said something that didn't sit right. Not because it was strange on its own, but because of how she said it. Flat, like she was reading it off a screen instead of thinking about it. She said, "You're the only one we've got out there tonight. So be careful. That grade's taken people before." I didn't ask her what she meant. I wish now I had. Wyatt was still hunched over the ledger when I got back inside, running his thumb along the edge of the page, and he pointed something out that I hadn't caught. Every other entry on that page, going back through the evening, was written in the same dark blue ballpoint. Fresh ink, still a little wet-looking under the light. Ours wasn't. Ours was written in a lighter ink, almost gray, the kind that happens when a pen's been sitting in a drawer for years, and the ink started to dry out inside the tube. It didn't match anything else on the page. It looked like it had been sitting there a long time, waiting for the rest of the page to catch up to it. That's when a man came out from the back room, and neither one of us heard a door, just suddenly he was there. An older guy in a company jacket with Calder Summit stitched over the pocket, moving slow like his knees bothered him. He didn't introduce himself. He looked at us and said, "Glad you made it. Told you that West Ramp was going to be a mess tonight." Like we'd already had a whole conversation with him that neither of us remembered having. Wyatt caught it too. I could tell by the look on his face. And he said, "Sir, we just walked in. We haven't talked to anybody." The man just nodded slow, like that was a perfectly normal thing to hear, and said, "That's right. You called it in earlier. I wrote it down right here." And he tapped the ledger without even looking at it. Right on our names. We never called anything in. We didn't have a reason to. And there's no cell signal on that stretch strong enough to make a call even if we'd wanted to, which Wyatt pointed out to him, and the man just shrugged like it didn't matter to him either way. While Wyatt kept talking to him, I drifted over to a little bank of monitors by the door, the kind that show the lot and the scale and the truck bays, so the attendant can watch trucks roll through without stepping outside in the cold. Our truck was on one of the screens, easy to spot with our company colors, except it wasn't parked where we'd left it. On the monitor, our truck sat over at Bay 3, backed in tight against the chain-up area, engine running, exhaust curling up into the floodlight. We'd parked at Bay 1. I know we did, because Wyatt always backs in at an angle so he doesn't have to jackknife it out again, and that's exactly how it looked in the lot when we walked in 5 minutes earlier. I said something to Wyatt about it, and we both went back outside to check, and our truck was sitting right where we left it, Bay 1, engine off, nothing running. But there were fresh tire tracks laid into the frost, leading toward Bay 3, tread marks that matched our drive tires close enough that Wyatt crouched down and ran his glove along one of them without saying anything for a second. Neither one of us had driven that truck anywhere since we parked it. Standing out there in the cold, I started stacking things up in my head that I'd been brushing off all night without really noticing. A song on the radio around 9 that played twice within an hour, word for word, like the station looped it. A mile marker outside of Amarillo. I could have sworn we passed once already, hours earlier, though that didn't make sense on a straight run north. Small things. The kind of thing you write off as tired eyes on a long shift. Except now, they were stacking up into something that didn't feel like tired eyes anymore. We went back inside and I asked the man straight out how long that ledger entry had been sitting there, because the ink didn't match, and I asked him how long he'd worked at that station. He got quieter than he'd been, rubbed the back of his neck, and said longer than he liked to think about some nights. Then, instead of answering the question about the ink, he reached under the counter and pulled out an older ledger, the cover cracked and soft with handling, and set it down next to the new one, flipping through it slow, like he already knew the page he was looking for. He found it and turned the book around to face us, and there it was, same handwriting, same lighter, drier ink, our names again, Dale Kessler and Wyatt Combs, Cross Anchor Freight, Unit 1147, Chain Inspection, 3:47 a.m., same exact time, different year, stamped at the top of the page, 11 Thanksgivings back. Neither one of us had been driving together that long ago. We met at Cross Anchor 9 years back. The man closed the old ledger real gentle, like it was something he didn't like handling more than he had to, and he told us the story without us even asking anymore, because I think by then he could see it on our faces that we needed to hear it. He said there'd been a team come through here one Thanksgiving, a long time back. Checked in for the same chain inspection, same grade. Bad ice that year too. Got cleared to go, headed up toward Cutter's Pass. And somewhere on the second switchback, the tractor lost its trailer on the ice and went through the guardrail on the outside curve. Didn't find them till the next afternoon. He said their names the same way you'd read them off a headstone, slow and careful, and they were our names. Not similar, not close, exactly ours. And the truck they'd been driving had a cracked mirror bracket on the driver's side that the accident report noted because it was one of the only parts they recovered intact. He said the time on the report, the estimated time of the accident based on when the ice storm hit its worst on the pass, was 3:47 in the morning. I asked him why he wrote our names down again tonight, before we'd even pulled in, and he looked at me like the question surprised him, like he hadn't really thought about it that way before. He said every year around this time, a team shows up matching, and every year he writes it down when he feels it coming, same as writing down the weather, because by now, it's just part of what happens at Calder Summit on Thanksgiving night. He said most years, whoever comes through doesn't come back down off that grade the way they went up it. We didn't take Cutter's Pass that night. The man didn't try to stop us from taking it. Not exactly, but he didn't have to say much for us to understand that skipping it entirely was the point. We ran 3 hours out of route to catch the southern highway instead, the long way around the mountain, and Wyatt drove the whole stretch without saying more than a few words, both of us watching the clock tick past 3:47 with the radio off for once, listening to nothing but the engine and the tires on dry pavement. We made Denver by Friday morning, load intact, nothing between us and the dock but a long stretch of empty highway and a silence that neither one of us tried to fill. And every Thanksgiving since, no matter what dispatch says about the miles or the pay, we take the long way around Cutter's Pass. No debate, no discussion, because now we know exactly what that ledger entry was waiting for us to become, and we're not interested in finding out what happens the year we decide to save the 3 hours. The dashboard clock read 6:11 when Claire called that morning to remind me. Not a text, a call, which meant she was serious. Be home by 7, Mitch. I mean it this time. Emma's been asking about tonight for a week. I told her I would. I meant it too. 340 miles between me and that promise, and I'd made the drive enough times to know exactly which exits would cost me time and which ones I could push through. By 4 in the afternoon, I was already behind. Construction near mile marker 60 had me sitting in a line of brake lights for 40 minutes, watching the fuel gauge tick down, while the sun dropped lower over the flat fields on either side of the interstate. I had the radio off. I do that sometimes, when I'm trying to think, when I want the cab quiet enough to hear myself plan. I was running numbers on when I'd actually pull into the driveway. 7:30 if I was lucky, maybe 8. The phone buzzed in the cup holder around 5. Home lit up on the screen. I reached for it out of instinct, and my hand hit the console instead, because right then, a semi was drifting into my lane, and I needed both hands on the wheel more than I needed to answer a phone call. It rang 4 times and went quiet. I told myself I'd call back the second I hit the next way station. I didn't get the chance. 4 minutes later, it rang again. Same word on the screen. Home. That part snagged on something in the back of my mind, because Claire doesn't call twice in a row. If I miss her once, she texts. She's told me 100 times she doesn't like leaving a phone ringing out because it makes her anxious, waiting for someone to pick up. Twice in 4 minutes wasn't like her. But I was boxed in on both sides by trailers doing 65, and by the time I had a hand free to grab the phone, it had already gone to voicemail on its own. I took the next exit, mostly because I needed gas, but also because that second call had put a knot in my stomach I couldn't drive through. I pulled into a rest stop, threw the truck in park, and had the phone in my hand before the engine even settled. It rang a 3rd time while I was holding it. I didn't let it go past the first ring. Hello? Claire? There was breathing on the other end, quick and shallow, the kind you hear from somebody who's been crying. Then a small voice, thin as paper. "Daddy? The water's coming up over the step. Can you come get me?" It wasn't Claire's voice. It was Emma's, but younger somehow, the way she used to sound at 5, not 7. And there was no way that made sense, because I know what my own daughter sounds like, and this wasn't the version of her that exists right now. I said her name. I asked where her mother was. There was a sound, like the line folding in on itself. A flat hum that wasn't a busy signal and wasn't static, just an absence where a voice should have been, and then nothing. The call was still connected. The timer was still running. I could see it counting up on the screen, but there was no one there anymore. I hit redial before I'd even lowered the phone from my ear. It didn't ring. It didn't do anything. The screen just said, "Call failed," and when I tried again, same thing. Straight into a silence that felt different from a normal dropped call, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. I called Claire's cell next, the number I knew by heart, not the one that had just shown up on my screen. She picked up on the second ring with the sound of a television going in the background and the clatter of a pan being set down. "Hey, you close? I've got the chicken in. We're just waiting on you." I asked her if she'd just called me. She said no. She hadn't touched her phone in 20 minutes. She'd been elbow deep in dinner. I asked about Emma. She said Emma had been asleep since 6:30, worn out from swim practice. Hadn't made a peep since Claire tucked her in. I stood there in the gravel lot with the phone against my ear, trying to make that line up with what I'd just heard, and it wouldn't. I read her the number off my call log while she went quiet on the other end. Not her cell. A different number entirely. Area code from 3 towns over, one that scratched at something familiar in the back of my head before I could place it. Claire didn't say anything for a second. Then, quiet, like she didn't want to say it out loud. "Mitch, that's the house on Larkspur. That's our old number. We had that disconnected almost 2 years ago." I remember the exact temperature of the air changing around me, though obviously it hadn't. Nothing outside had changed at all. The house on Larkspur was the one we'd sold after the flood. The storm that hit 2 Augusts back. The one where I was 400 miles out on a haul, when the drains backed up and the water came up through the basement, and then up the stairs. And Claire and Emma spent 6 hours on the 2nd floor, with no power and no cell signal for half the county, waiting for a boat to come get them off the porch roof. I hadn't known any of it happened until I pulled into a truck stop at 2 in the morning and saw 11 missed calls stacked up on my screen. I've never told anyone how long I sat in that parking lot afterward. Some things you just carry. "Today's the date," Claire said, and I could hear her working it out as she said it. "It's the anniversary." I almost forgot, with everything going on with dinner. I sat there with that landing on me. 2 years to the day, and somehow it had slipped past both of us in the noise of a Tuesday. I don't fully know why I keyed up the CB after I hung up with her. Habit, maybe, or needing to hear another voice that wasn't in my own head. Big Sam was on the same stretch that night, hauling produce east, and when I mentioned the calls, he went quiet, in a way that told me before he said a word that I wasn't the first person to bring this up to him. He said guys who've run this corridor a long time talk about the Larkspur exit, about calls coming through on old disconnected lines around the anniversary of the bad flood years. Always the same handful of nights every summer. Said he'd never put stock in any of it until his own phone did it to him once, 3 years back, and he still hadn't told his wife what the voice on the line had said to him that night. Standing outside the cab afterward, my phone buzzed with a flash flood warning for the county, the kind that comes with the loud alert tone that makes you flinch. I checked the sky. Clear. No clouds. Nothing on the horizon that matched a warning like that. The forecast that morning had called for nothing but heat. I looked at that alert for longer than I want to admit. I told myself I was just going to swing by the old place on my way through, that it was 15 minutes out of the way, and I needed to see it for myself before I could let this go. The house looked exactly like a house nobody's bought in 2 years looks. For sale sign face down in the weeds, gutters hanging loose off one corner, grass grown up through the porch boards. I sat in the truck for a full minute before I got out, and I was already halfway to the back door when I saw it. A light, flickering faint and low, in the upstairs window. Emma's old room. The back door wasn't locked. Nobody had bothered. I went in through the kitchen, past cabinets standing open and empty, down the hallway to the basement stairs, because something was pulling me down there before I'd even decided to go. The water line was still visible on the wall, a pale ring at about waist height, 2 years old and never painted over. On the shelf above it sat an old answering machine, the kind with a cassette tape, plugged into an outlet that by every reasonable measure shouldn't have still had power running to it. The message light was blinking. I pressed play, with my thumb shaking more than I wanted it to. It was Claire's voice from 2 years ago, hoarse and scared, leaving a message on our old machine because the cell towers were down, and it was the only line that would connect. And underneath her voice, in the background, Emma crying, 5 years old, saying the exact words I'd heard on my phone an hour earlier. The water's coming up over the step. Can you come get me? Word for word. Same rhythm, same breath, caught in the same place. My phone rang while I was still standing there, with that tape hissing in the dark basement. Claire. And this time, there was no television in the background, no clatter of dinner. Just her voice, tight and fast, saying Emma wasn't in her bed. She'd gone up to check on a feeling she couldn't explain, and the room was empty, the back door standing open, and she didn't know where our daughter was. I don't remember most of the drive back. I remember calling it in to Claire's neighbor to check the yard. I remember running every red light on the county road. I remember my hands not feeling like they belonged to me. I got there before the ambulance did. Claire was in the upstairs hallway, soaked to the knees, holding Emma against her chest, both of them dripping onto the hardwood. The bathroom door was open behind them, and water was still sheeting out over the threshold, the tub overflowing, faucet running full blast. Emma was awake, but glassy, the way kids get when they've been walking in their sleep, mumbling something about the water rising, not understanding why everyone was crying and hugging her all at once. She was fine, cold, scared, confused, but fine. It took 20 minutes to get the water shut off, and the towels down, and everyone breathing normal again. Nobody in that hallway was thinking yet about what time anything had actually happened, not until much later, lying awake next to Claire, when I ran the numbers in my head over and over. The call had come in on my phone a full hour before Emma ever got out of bed, before the tub ever started running, before there was any water at all for her to be talking about. I never told Claire about the house on Larkspur, about the tape still playing in that basement on a wire that had no business carrying current. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was grief, finding a way to warn me, or memory bleeding backward into a night that needed it, or just two impossible things that happened to land on top of each other on the one date of the year, when the wound in our family sits closest to the surface. I only know that I got there in time, and that some part of me has stopped needing an explanation for why. I still keep that old number saved in my phone under home, even though it's never rung again since. Some nights, parked at a rest stop with the engine ticking as it cools, I think about calling it just to see. I never do. I've been driving trucks for going on 38 years now, and if you spend that long behind a wheel, you hear every ghost story the road has to offer. The hitchhiker who vanishes from your sleeper, the phantom semi with no driver that runs you off at 3 in the morning. I've heard them all told by grown men, with hands shaking around a coffee cup at a truck stop counter, and I've never believed a single one. Not because I think I'm smarter than the next guy, but because in almost 4 decades of hauling freight through every kind of dark, lonely stretch this country has, I've never seen anything I couldn't explain by morning. That's the frame of mind I want you to hold on to, because it matters for what happened to me this past November, out on a detour I never should have taken. I was running a load of refrigerated produce up from the valley, contracted to make a drop before 6 a.m., when I hit a hard closure on the interstate. Bridge inspection, orange barrels for 2 miles, state trooper waving everybody off onto a county route I hadn't touched in maybe 15 years. My GPS didn't even want to acknowledge the detour existed. It kept trying to reroute me back into the closed lanes like it knew something I didn't. I switched to a paper atlas I keep behind the seat. Old habit from before. Every rig had a screen. and traced out a 2-lane that would loop me back to the highway about 40 miles north. Nothing special about it, just trees, a couple of gas stations, the kind of road where you go an hour without seeing another set of headlights. Out of habit more than anything, I had my CB radio dialed to channel 19, which is the channel every trucker in the country monitors, whether they're in Ohio or Oregon. Most nights it's just background noise, guys warning each other about a bear in the median, or griping about a Waffle House being closed. But about 20 minutes into that detour, somewhere around 1 in the morning, I picked up a voice coming through clean, no static, which is strange enough out in that kind of dead zone. He said, "Breaker, breaker, anybody got a copy out there? This is coming to you from mile marker 118 on the old 9, the stretch they shut down back in 91. I remember laughing a little because I knew that road. Old Route 9 hadn't existed as a through road in over 30 years. They decommissioned it after a wreck killed 3 drivers in a whiteout on a curve everybody used to call the Sawtooth. The bridge over Muddy Fork Creek partially collapsed not long after, and the state just let the whole stretch die instead of paying to fix it. There's no way anybody was broadcasting from mile marker 118 on a road that doesn't officially exist anymore. I keyed up anyway, mostly to mess with whoever this joker was, and asked him to repeat his 20. He came back immediately, like he'd been waiting on me, and described my rig down to the trailer number, the exact shade of the cab, and the fact that I had my running lights on instead of my brights, which I did because of the fog starting to roll in. Nobody on that road could have seen me well enough for that. I hadn't passed another vehicle in 20 minutes, and there were no lights behind me in my mirrors. I sat with that for a second, feeling the kind of cold drop in my stomach you get when something doesn't add up, and I told myself it was a coincidence, that plenty of rigs run their lights low in weather like that. Then he said something that took the wind clean out of me. He gave his handle as Loose Gravel. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in over 25 years. Loose Gravel was Earl Whitlock, a driver I used to run parallel routes with back in my 20s, a big, soft-spoken man who taught me how to back a trailer into a dock with 2 inches of clearance on either side. Earl died on that exact stretch of Route 9, in that exact wreck that got the road shut down. I was at his funeral. I helped carry the casket. There is no version of reality where Earl Whitlock is on a CB radio in the middle of the night, and yet here was a voice using his handle on the very road where he died, describing my truck like he was standing beside it. I told myself it had to be somebody who knew the story, somebody local, playing a trick on drivers dumb enough to get rerouted onto this back road. That's a real thing. Truckers messing with each other over the radio, especially on stretches with a reputation. So I pushed on, foot a little heavier than it needed to be, and the fog kept thickening in a way the forecast hadn't called for, rolling up off the low fields on either side, until my high beams just bounced back at me useless. And through all of it that voice kept talking, low and unhurried, telling me to watch for a green mile marker sign coming up on my right, one the state was supposed to have pulled decades ago. I told myself there was no way a sign like that could still be standing. Then my headlights caught it, half swallowed in kudzu. The paint faded, but the number still legible. 118. That's when the voice started giving me directions I hadn't asked for. "Take the next left past the old grain silo," he said. "There's a shortcut that'll save you 20 minutes getting back to the highway." Every instinct in me said to keep going straight, stick to the route I'd already planned. But there's a pull that comes with being talked to by something, using a dead friend's voice and dead friend's handle. A pull toward wanting to understand it, rather than run from it. I eased off at the silo, more out of some need to prove to myself it was nothing, and idled there a minute with my hazards on, just listening to him keep talking into the dead air, like he didn't even need me to answer anymore. I ended up pulling into a gas station about 15 miles further on, hands not exactly steady, and the woman behind the counter, maybe 60, been working that same register longer than I've been driving, didn't even blink when I asked her about strange chatter coming off Old 9. She said I wasn't the first driver that month to come in asking, said there'd been complaints filed with the county about somebody running an illegal repeater out that direction, messing with drivers who get rerouted off the interstate. She said the odd part was there's no power out there, No lines running that deep into the old road. Hadn't been since before the shutdown. Whoever was doing it, she said, was running off a generator, which took some real effort to haul all the way out there and keep fueled. That detail should have settled me, should have made the whole thing feel like exactly what it probably was, some kid with a hobby and too much time. But then, sitting in that parking lot with my engine running, I caught something on the recording I'd made on my phone, without even fully meaning to, something I'd missed the first time through. In the middle of all that talk about mile markers and dead men's handles, the voice mentioned a song that had been playing on his radio, a song that didn't come out until years after Earl Whitlock was already in the ground. That single detail did more to convince me this was a living person than anything else had, because whatever this was, it wasn't stuck in 1991. It knew what year it actually was, which meant it was choosing to sound like it didn't. I got back in my truck, and instead of continuing north, like any sane man would have, I turned back toward the old road, telling myself I just needed to see it, needed daylight logic laid over whatever my nerves had built up in the dark. About 2 miles past the collapsed section of Muddy Fork Bridge, where the asphalt gives out into gravel, and the guardrail's been torn away for decades, I saw a set of fresh tire tracks cutting off into the tree line, and a thin wire running up into the branches that could only be an antenna. I followed the tracks on foot with my flashlight, heart going harder than I wanted to admit, and found a pickup truck backed into a clearing, a card table set up under a tarp, a car battery, an old CB base unit, and a young man, maybe 25, who about jumped out of his skin when my light hit him. He didn't run. He just stood there with his hands half up, and when I asked him straight out what he thought he was doing, he told me his name was Cody Whitlock, Earl's grandson. He said his grandfather kept journals, recordings even, cassette tapes of himself practicing his old radio patter, and Cody had grown up listening to them after Earl died, before he was even born. He told me that GPS apps had started routing trucks down Old 9 as a shortcut, drivers trusting a screen over common sense, not knowing the bridge was half gone, and the curve past it could still put a rig into the creek bed in bad weather. 2 years back, a driver had nearly died taking that exact route on a foggy night, jackknifed just short of the collapsed section. Cody said he couldn't get the county to put up better signage, couldn't get anybody to take a dead road seriously, so he started doing this instead. Using his grandfather's old handle, his grandfather's real cadence off those tapes, scaring drivers bad enough that they'd turn back, rather than push forward into a wreck waiting to happen. He said it worked better than any warning sign ever could, because fear moves people faster than caution does. I stood there in that clearing with my flashlight on him a long while, and I want to say I felt nothing but relief, that it all made sense now. A grieving kid, running an elaborate safety campaign out of guilt and love, in equal measure. And mostly I did feel that. I even told him it was a decent thing he was trying to do, in a strange way, even if the county would probably shut him down for it eventually. We talked another 20 minutes standing out there in the cold, him showing me the tapes, the journals, explaining how he'd learned to mimic that particular rasp Earl used to get in his voice past midnight. But there was one thing he said, almost as an afterthought while I was walking back to my truck, that I haven't been able to shake since. I asked him how he knew to describe my rig so exact that first time, the trailer number, the running lights instead of brights, and he told me he hadn't been able to see me at all that night. Said his little setup out there doesn't have the range or the visibility to pick out details like that. Not through fog, not from that distance, not with equipment that old. He said he'd just been reading off whatever came into his head, same as always, and it usually didn't line up with anything real. I drove the rest of that route in silence, radio off, and I made my delivery on time, same as always. I've turned it over plenty since, and I still land in the same place. It was a kid honoring his grandfather in his own strange, kind of reckless way, trying to keep drivers off a dead road before it kills somebody else. That's the whole truth of it, plain and human, nothing more. I believe that. But every now and then, usually on a foggy night when I'm running that same stretch of interstate, I find myself reaching over and turning the CB down to channel 19 anyway, just to listen for a second longer than I need to, and I couldn't honestly tell you what I'm hoping or dreading to hear.